There are some stories that do not begin with a monster, they begin with a funeral. A child is born, the family hopes. The child dies, the family breaks. Then another child comes, with the same pull, the same fear, the same feeling that grief has somehow found its way back to the same house. In some Igbo communities, that child may be called Ogbanje. In some Yoruba communities, that child may be called Abiku. And if you have only heard those words as internet shorthand for spirit child, then tonight we need to slow down. Because this is not just a ghost story. It is also a language of grief, a system of meaning, and a ritual answer to the unbearable question every hurting family asks when death becomes a pattern. Why is this happening again?
That word again is doing a lot of work. One loss is grief. Repeated loss feels like a curse with perfect memory.
Exactly. That is the emotional ground these traditions rise from. Not random creepiness, repeated mourning, repeated hope, repeated terror. But before we go further, I need to make something clear. Ogbanje and Abiku are often discussed together, sometimes too casually, sometimes as if they are interchangeable. They are not. They share a family resemblance, but the deeper cosmology, the internal logic, and the ritual response are not identical. So tonight, I want to let each tradition keep its own shape.
A useful starting point is this. Both traditions deal with repeated childhood death, but they do not imagine the returning child in exactly the same way.
In the Igbo framework, Ogbanje is often understood as a soul trapped in a destructive cycle of birth, death, and return within the same family. One of the most striking Igbo details is the idea of the Iwa, a hidden object, sometimes imagined as a small stone, bead, or buried token, believed to tie the child to the cycle. If that object could be found and destroyed, the loop could be broken.
That image is brutal. The family is not only grieving a child, they are searching for the mechanism of grief itself, like pain left clues underground.
Yes. And that is what makes the Ogbanje story feel so cinematic. It has emotional stakes, spiritual tension, and a concrete object. Now compare that with Abiku in Yoruba tradition. Abiku is often described less as a trapped human soul and more as a spirit being whose true loyalty remains with the spirit world, a visitor rather than a captive. Its earthly life is temporary by nature, not merely interrupted by accident. That shift changes everything. If Ogbanje feels like a soul entangled in a cycle that can be cut loose from, Abiku often feels like a spirit whose home was never fully here to begin with. That second frame leads us to one of the most heartbreaking details in the Abiku tradition, the names. Malomo, do not go again. Durojaye, stay and enjoy life. Rotimi, stay with me. Kosoko, there is no hoe to dig another grave. These are not decorative names. They are grief spoken aloud. Names as negotiation. Names as spiritual pleading. Names as a mother refusing to let language stay neutral in the face of death.
You can feel the bargaining inside the syllables. The parent is not just naming a baby. They are arguing with fate in public.
If these beliefs had only offered fear, they would not have endured. They endured because they also offered action. In many Igbo settings, the family might consult a dibia, a healer or diviner asked to read what ordinary sight could not. If the child was understood as Ogbanje, the search for the Iwa could begin. Imagine the emotional charge of that. A whole family holding its breath over an object hidden somewhere in the earth, convinced that if this thing is found, their child might finally live.
That is grief with a mission, which may be the only kind of grief that lets people stand up in the morning.
The Yoruba response often moved through a different emotional architecture. Families might go to a babalawel. Rituals, offerings, protective measures, and naming practices could all become part of persuading the child to remain in this world. Not every family did the same thing, but the common thread is clear. If death keeps circling the house, the community must answer it with language, ritual, and intention.
From a systems perspective, these responses also perform social work. They gave families a script, a specialist to consult, a process to follow, and a communal frame for suffering that would otherwise feel random.
When modern people hear ritual, they often think irrational, but that is lazy thinking. A ritual can be metaphysical. A ritual can be communal. A ritual can be psychological. A ritual can help people keep living when language alone collapses. Now we arrive at the question modern viewers always ask first. Was this spiritual belief really a way of describing medical reality? The honest answer is, some scholars think there is overlap, but no serious treatment of this topic should pretend the matter is settled. Before modern pediatrics, genetics, and neonatal care, repeated child death was devastatingly common. When the same kind of suffering seems to strike the same family again and again, people search for a pattern. They search for meaning. They search for a name.
This is also where sickle cell disease enters the conversation. Some scholars have argued that certain cases labeled Ogbanje may have overlapped with recurring hereditary illness, including sickle cell. But overlap is not equivalence.
Exactly. This is where online summaries become reckless. They hear one study and sprint to a headline like, "So Ogbanje was just sickle cell." No, that is too crude, too confident, and too dismissive. A medical explanation can describe symptom patterns and inherited risk, but that does not automatically erase the worldview that formed around repeated loss. A disease model asks, what is happening in the body? A spiritual model asks, what does this loss mean? Why this family? Why this pattern? Why does grief feel personal?
Modern people still ask both questions, even with lab work, even with diagnosis. We still want data, and then after the data, we still whisper, why us?
That is the part people miss. Science can make some mechanisms clearer. That is not the same thing as healing the emotional wound. When a parent loses children repeatedly, medical language may explain the how. It does not automatically satisfy the ache of the why. So I think the fairest way to hold this topic is like this. Some cases may have overlapped with recurring illness or inherited conditions. But Ogbanje and Abiku cannot be reduced to diagnostic placeholders. They are larger than that. They are cosmologies of recurrence. They are grief made legible. If Ogbanje and Abiku belonged only to the past, they would be easier to file away. But they do not. They live in literature, in naming, in memory, in debate, and in the way people still struggle to talk about childhood suffering without needing the story to mean something. Writers keep returning to these ideas because they hold identity, destiny, repetition, pain, alienation, and longing all at once. You can feel that in the larger literary world around this topic. the classic Nigerian writers who used spirit child imagery to think through history and identity, the poetry that made the child both intimate and untouchable, the novels that turned repetition itself into narrative structure, and the modern writers who reopened Ogbanje and Abiku as living frameworks rather than museum pieces.
A spirit child is not only a child in those stories. It becomes a symbol for anyone who feels half-claimed by another world, another history, another version of themselves.
Yes, but we should be careful there too. Metaphor can open a tradition. It can also dilute it. For many people, these are not only symbols, they are spiritually real frameworks with their own integrity. Maybe that is why this topic still feels so alive, because it refuses to sit politely in one category. It is folklore, but also family history. It is spiritual belief, but also social survival. It is grief, but also structure. It is about the body, and about what the body cannot explain by itself.
A binary conclusion would be tempting here. It would also be inaccurate.
So we are not doing the fake neat ending. Love that for us.
No fake neat ending. Maybe some viewers will leave this story believing more strongly in spirit. Maybe some will leave thinking more deeply about child mortality, inherited illness, and historical suffering. Maybe some will leave holding both in the same hand. What matters to me is that we do not treat African cosmology as primitive debris that modernity came to clean up. These traditions emerged from people observing patterns, naming pain, and building rituals sturdy enough to carry the weight of repeated loss. So was it medical or mystical? Maybe that question is too small. Maybe the deeper question is this: what stories do human beings create when death keeps returning to the same house? And what does it mean when those stories are not only frightening, but tender, not only supernatural, but practical? Not only about the dead, but about the living, trying very hard not to break. That, to me, is where Ogbanje and Abiku still breathe. Not in lazy debunking, but in the space where mourning becomes meaning.
That is the kind of haunting that does not disappear when the lights come on.
It becomes a framework for endurance.
And perhaps that is why these stories remain, because every culture has to answer grief somehow. This is one of the most profound answers West Africa ever gave. If this story stayed with you, tell me why. Was it the buried object, the names spoken like pleas, the idea of the child as trapped soul or spirit visitor, or the uncomfortable truth that science can maim a mechanism and grief will still ask for more?